Hello everybody, my name is Draenic, and in this video we're going to talk about all the consumables that you need, and some maybe that you need a little bit less but are situationally useful in Mythic Plus. This is all the ones I could think of. There's actually quite a lot of them, but if there's anything cool that I've forgotten about, let me know in the comments and we'll add them later. So starting off here, we have Flasks. These are the easiest, lowest investment way that you can get a power level benefit. There's different ones, of course, for agility, intellect, and strength. Using the one of these, the greater one, from the new from patch 8.2 is going to be good for you, so make sure that you get that. You may also want a stamina flask. So the greater flask of the vast horizon is something to have access to. You may find yourself getting just barely one shot by like tyrannical freehold, tyrannical Toldegor, those sorts of cases where there's if you're trying to do high keys, you may end up getting just barely one shot, and this might be enough stamina to get you over the edge. So that's something that you may want to have access to in your bags as well. Food is also really good to have. Stat food, whatever your best stat is. Eating that before the dungeon starts, obviously you get a buff that persists until you die. Usually it's not worth it to fully spend 10 seconds eating after you die to get a food buff again. Usually that's not a good use of time, and it's better to just keep going through the dungeon. But one little known piece of food buff that you may not be aware of is the Dark Moon Sugar-Crusted Fish Feast. This is a really powerful item that I think everybody should have access to, especially healers in your group. It puts down a feast that, first of all, this heals very quickly. So if your group is all low, you can get topped up in like 2 seconds by having everybody eat this thing. And it comes with a small versatility buff as well, that you get well fed after like a second and a half of this. So if you don't have time to eat a full food buff, this can be a really good thing to have, and it can help heal you through like, you need to heal up Grievous off of everybody in the group, for instance. This can be a good way to do that out of combat without your healer having to like die and panic. And it's a good way for them to regenerate mana too. Healers should also bring probably water. If these can be fairly expensive, you may not want to do all the Dark Moon fishing to get these. So your healer may want to also bring just stacks of water or mage food to regenerate mana with between pulls. Okay, next up are potions. In patch 8.2, there are actually a bunch of different good potions to have, so you probably need more than one potion keybind for many specs. For me as an Outlaw Rogue, I use Unbridled Fury on single target, I use Empowered Proximity on AoE, and I even use Superior Battle Potion of Agility on mid-range, like 3 target pulls. So having access to all those sorts of different potions is a good idea. If you don't care and you don't want to have a lot of keybinds, I completely understand. Just binding one of those, maybe Unbridled Furies for tyrannical weeks and Agipots for fortified weeks or whatever, is definitely it's fine. But it's better to have access to as many of these as is optimal for your spec. Everybody should also come into the dungeon with a full stack of Abyssal healing potions. These things restore so much health. They're like 133,000 health. That's a lot of health. So having a full stack of these can be massive in many different dungeons for surviving. Like if you're using these intelligently, you can avoid dying so many times in a key. Healers may also be interested in potions of replenishment, as well as coastal mana potions. The potion of replenishment restores a lot more mana. It restores an extra more than double as much mana, but they have to like sit and drink it for 10 seconds. They can do it in the middle of combat, but that means they can't take actions. So this can be useful if they need more mana for the fight, and especially if people can survive. Maybe you're doing the third boss in Temple, Galv, and you have somebody like immunity soak a pillar while the healer drinks their mana pot. That kind of thing can be a useful strategy there. Or maybe you have, the Shadow Priest Vampiric Embrace while the healer drinks. Otherwise, yeah, just coastal mana potions gives you a little burst of mana that might be enough to get you through the fight. Finally, if you're super rich, you may want to use Augment runes in your dungeon runs. I don't even do these in most of my keys. I'll do them for like 23s and higher right now, but lower than that, I'm not bothering. These things are expensive, and it's a pretty small amount of primary stat. But if you're really interested in squeezing out a little bit of extra damage, this is a thing that can do that. Okay, if you don't have a warrior in your group, you're going to want War Scrolls of Battle Shout to buff everybody's attack power. If you don't have a mage, you're going to want War Scrolls of Intellect. And if you don't have a priest, you're going to want War Scrolls of Fortitude. Those are all lesser versions of Battle Shout, Arcane Intellect, and Power Word Fortitude, but it's really good to have access to these. And you may also want a weak aura that reminds you if you don't have it active, so that you can remember to use these things. There are also some utility potions that you may want access to. Skystep is one of them, or Lightfoot. These are the same effect. Skystep comes with a slightly different, like it comes with like a little ball that you're walking on as well, but Functionally, these two are the same. There are basically no cases where one is any different, so whichever of these is cheaper on your auction house or whichever you prefer graphically, just getting a bunch of those can let you... Sometimes you'll want to like skip a long way in one shroud, and so you can have everybody Lightfoot in the shroud and get to the end of it that way. Or sometimes you just need to do a mechanic and you need to get from point A to point B more quickly, and this is a panic button that you can use to do that. There are also a bunch of different ways to go invisible with potions. These do put your potions on a 5-minute cooldown, which is annoying. It's not as good as Shroud, but Skaggle Drink, Dimitri's Draught of Deception are both good options. There's also like Draenic ones too, and other ones from previous expansions that I don't think they're all quite as good as the ones from Legion and BFA, but they all do pretty much the same thing and will mostly work for the same skips. Okay, now if you don't have anybody in your group who can Bloodlust, it's a really good idea to make sure somebody has drums in your group. There are like 10 different kinds of drums. There's drums of the mountain, drums of the maelstrom, drums of fury, drums of rage. I think there might even be more. So making sure that you carry around a stack of these is a really good idea, because classes that can do Bloodlust are not actually all that popular in Mythic Plus right now. So it's I'd say more often than not, you're going to need to be drumsing and not lusting. And so because of that, making sure that you also have a stack of these is a really good thing, so you don't end up in this spot where just everybody assumes that somebody else brought drums and you can't lust. The best profession for Mythic Plus is generally engineering, so that you can get an unstable temporal time shifter. This is a battle res that you can use. It takes 4 seconds to cast it, and you have to stand right on top of somebody to battle res them. And there's a chance for it to backfire and do a bunch of damage to you, so that doesn't happen all that often, but it can. Especially if you're like a rogue, this is a really good thing to have, especially if you're not going to play with other classes that have battle reses. But even if you have one person in your group who has a battle res, if that person dies, being able to res them is really valuable. And there are many skips where it's useful to have access to battle reses on other characters. Again, rogue, really good here, because rogues can just vanish off combat at the end of a skip and then battle res the healer. Or they can even do it without a battle res. If you're an engineer, you can go get the ultimate Gnomish army knife, and that will give you a chance to resurrect a dead ally once every 10 minutes. It's an out-of-combat res, but this one does not... So since it doesn't cost a B-res, that's better, right? That you can do this even if you don't have any available, and you can save a B-res. Often I'll be in these skips where like 2 rogues and a mage will all use their knives and see if any of them work on the healer before then using an actual B-res, unstable temporal time shifter thing. It's worth noting that this doesn't, as I said, it actually has a chance of failure. Like the other one, if it fails, will just do a bunch of damage to you, and that happens rarely. But the ultimate Gnomish army knife is like 50-50 whether it actually works and casts a B-res or casts a res, so sometimes this doesn't actually do anything. You can't rely on it, you can just try it. Engineering also can create bombs, fried bombs. These don't require engineering, so you can just get them off the auction house if you're not an engineer. And these can be useful for pulling mobs that are in stealth. So like a Taldazar, for instance, has some like stalkers that hang out in weird places that you can throw fried bombs at if you want to pull them, and your class doesn't actually have like a targeted ground effect that you can throw in that direction. So this is something that if you're one of those classes, if you're doing one of those dungeons and you want to pull those, it might be something worth looking into. Now, if you have a warlock in your group, you can make healthstones throughout the dungeon, and that can be pretty good. But even if you don't have a warlock in your group, you can get somebody's warlock into your group before starting the key, and then get healthstones from them, and then kick them from the group and do the key with, the 5 people that aren't a warlock. And that's usually, like, almost all top Mythic Plus runs uses a strategy. If somebody is warlock alt, gets summoned to the dungeon, makes healthstones, and then they log back over to their main, or they even have 2 Battle.net accounts so that they can do it without needing to log out and log back in. And this is really strong. You can even have, if a tank goes through all 3 of these, the rogue can then trade them however many stacks they have left of Healthstone, and you can get more than 3 Healthstone charges onto your tank throughout the dungeon that way. Extremely useful thing to be doing. If you find yourself pushing keys and, you're close, you're right on the line there of being able to time them or not, starting to use Healthstones is what I'd recommend when you reach that level where you're actually running up against the timer, or you're running up against like barely survivable boss fights. When you're inside a Mythic Plus dungeon, you can't use tomes, but before the key starts, you can, and there are some specs that benefit from swapping talents before a key starts. Outlaw Rogue is one of them, for instance. Outlaw Rogues can use a tome, talent over to a talent called Loaded Dice, and then they can press Adrenaline Rush, get a Loaded Dice buff, and then change their talent back to Alacrity. And then they can go into the dungeon and carry that Loaded Dice buff in. This is, it's a little weird. Some people don't like doing it, but it is a strategy used by many people in high keys. So if your spec has something like that, you may be interested in carrying some tomes. Everybody should just have tomes anyways, right, for raids. So If you're interested in doing stuff on your character, it's just a good idea to carry around a stack of these and not be anchored to a rest area if you want to change talents and essences. Okay, speaking of weird rogue things, racing flags are this little toy that you can drop. You have to get to Revered with the Order of the Cloud Serpent, which means you have to do some dailies. But once you do that, you will get these. You can buy these stacks of racing flags, and you can put them on the ground. And notably, rogues can shadow step these. Rogues that aren't playing Outlaw, so Assassination or Subtlety rogues can shadow step to these, which can be very useful for certain boss mechanics. And you can, if you're using the Aquapotent Nautilus trinket, this is a trinket from Eternal Palace that is very popular in Mythic Plus. A really common strategy with this is to place a racing flag on the far side of the targets you want to hit, and then actually target that with your Nautilus, and that will send the wave through the pack, applying the dot to everybody. Then it'll hit the flag and start coming back to you, and just as the dot is falling off of the pack, the wave crashes through them again, and you get much more dot uptime on the targets by having it hit them in the middle of the wave's travel versus right at the end before it starts running back. You'll get like 8 seconds of Surging Flood dot instead of 3 or 4 or whatever it is. So Racing Flag, extremely good for that circumstance if you're using that trinket. This isn't one that is used all that often, but Purification Potions are worth being aware of, at least. You can get a stack of these, and if you get into a really dire spot where you have a poison on you and nobody's poison dispel is up, or you're playing without one and it's going to kill you, you can drink this and it'll remove a curse of poison and a disease, so can be useful there. In a similar vein, the Draenic Living Action Potion makes you immune to stun effects, and also you can use it while stunned and break stuns. This is really good. My favorite place to use this is in Temple of Citralis. Those like Shrouded Fangs that come out of stealth and stun your tank? Your tank can just run into that pull, Draenic Living Action Potion, and be fine, instead of running into that pull, getting stunned, and dying, which is something that I've seen happen multiple times. Now, this has never happened to me, but sometimes you get in these dungeon runs where everything goes wrong and you die multiple times. And so in those spots, it would be useful to have an auto hammer. And that is something that you can just drop this on the ground, and then everybody can use it to repair. Carrying around a stack of these is very useful. Again, not necessary if, like me, you never die, but it's useful to have even just for the rest of your group if you want to be benevolent in those circumstances. Another useful item to know about is the Hearthstone. This is actually useful in parts of legitimate strategies in various dungeons. Back in Season 1, for instance, I would Hearth out of Siege of Borealis after we killed the second boss, and I would swap to Assassination from Subtlety for the last 2 bosses to do more single target damage. Right now, there's a very popular strategy in the Motherlode where after killing the second boss and most of the trash in the dungeon, people will Hearth out and tanks will swap to a more tanky against magic damage build. Warriors will drop things like Bolster and take things that are good against magic damage, and Null Barrier, those sorts of effects as well. DPS can also Hearth out there and swap to a full single target build for the last 2 bosses. And then you can just walk right back to the dungeon and your graveyard is updated, so you zone in right where the second boss died. And it costs you maybe 40 seconds to do this, but you can get your whole group geared up for the last 2 bosses. And this is something to always be on the lookout for in various dungeons if you come up with a cool strategy. For instance, Vengeance Demon Hunters can Hearth out in that spot, and they can switch to... so after the second boss in the Motherlode, they can then switch to a build that plays Conflict and Strife Major, which lets them dispel themselves every time they get chemical burned on the 3rd boss, which basically completely negates that ability. So those are things to be aware of. Swapping out, Hearthing out of a dungeon, swapping talents and essences is a legitimate strategy, especially in those places. Thanks everybody for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this little look at the consumables of Mythic Plus. There are like 20 of them that I mentioned, but I may have missed something. So if there's something cool that you use in your dungeons, put it in the comments below, and I'll try and pin any relevant comments that have something cool that I forgot about. Anyways, let me know what you thought of this video. I can make more like it. Of course, subscribe to the channel and stuff, and check out my Twitch stream, twitch.tv/Dratnos. Thanks everybody for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.